Today I want to talk to you about the argument from comparison. It is, I think, one of the deepest ancient arguments in favor of skepticism, and it's something that has had a major impact on contemporary philosophy. In fact, I think you can see Immanuel Kant's philosophy as the argument from comparison writ large. And so we're going to look at the argument from comparison in here, its ancient forms. There are really two variants of it, and I think they're both important for understanding the nature of the argument. It is one argument structure that they exemplify, but they bring out two importantly different aspects of comparison that are highly relevant to evaluating our state of mind about the world. So, let's think of the general problem of skepticism. We've got a perceiver, or a knower, someone who would like to think of himself as a rational believer, who has some state of mind about the world. And then we've got, I'll give this poor fellow arms, and then we've got the world. And the general problem of skepticism is, what's the relationship between our state of mind and the world? It's the general problem of the relation of mind to world. So, the skeptic worries that there's no way to establish anything about that relation. We have no reason to trust that our states of mind represent the world accurately. Why would we think that? The argument from comparison says, here's part of the problem at least. We don't, of course, just perceive the world as a unit. We perceive objects in the world. So, let's imagine ourselves as representing something in that world. Let's say, I don't know, a particular triangle. Let's make it simple. My artistic abilities are limited. Now, I perceive that, and I form some representation of it. I have some thought here, some perceptual experience maybe, about the triangle. Now, what's the problem? Why would I distrust my state of mind? Why would I think I'm not representing the world accurately? This argument from comparison worries about things in two different respects. There are two ways in which I might distrust what I'm seeing, or what I'm hearing, or what I'm tasting, or touching, or smelling, or thinking, for that matter. So let's take a look at the classic formulations of the argument from comparison. It appears first, I think, in a clear form in Sextus Empiricus' sixth mode. Here's how he frames it. The sixth mode is that based on admixtures, by which we conclude that because none of the real objects affects our senses by itself, but always in conjunction with something else, though we may possibly be able to state the nature of the resultant mixture formed by the external object and that along with which it is perceived, we shall not be able to say what is the exact nature of the external reality in itself. Philo of Alexandria worries about the same problem. What again are we to say of the quantities occurring in things compounded? Each separate thing is by itself incomprehensible, but by comparison with another thing, it's easy to understand. Nothing, in fact, Philo says, is ever presented to our view according to its real plain nature, but that everything has its most variable possible mixtures and combinations. Now here's the problem. We encounter the world not isolated, not seeing an object all by itself, seeing into its true nature. We see it in a certain environment. We see it surrounded by other things. We see it in comparison with other things. Moreover, we perceive it with our own perceptual capacities, and then we mentally process that and think about it and form a representation in our minds. There's a huge amount of neurophysiology going on between, for example, in the case of a visual perception, the light rays that enter the eye, that create a pattern on the retina, that send information up to the brain through the optic nerve, that are then processed by the brain, converting that two-dimensional image, as it were, or activation pattern on our retinas into a three-dimensional representation in our minds. There's a huge amount of processing going on. So problem one is that the object itself is appearing in a context, and we're perceiving the entire context and comparing the object to the other things in that context. And then there's a huge amount going on inside our heads. So we can say, yes, things are always appearing in combination, in admixtures, in comparison with other things. But they're mixed up together. In effect, the true nature of the object and what it's like is being mixed up in two ways. Mixed up in a way that makes it dependent on its context, and mixed up because it's dependent on our own perceptual and cognitive capacities. So, you might say, look, there are two important things happening here. We perceive the triangle, but partly we're perceiving it in a certain context, in comparison with the other things in that context. And the way we perceive it is shaped by the context. Cognitive psychologists have been examining the ways in which this is true, and it's really remarkable the extent to which our perceptions are dependent on context. If you show someone a color through a tube that isolates it and does not allow the person to compare that color to anything else in the surroundings, it turns out we can't identify the color. Something similar happens. This is sort of embarrassing, but something similar happens if you're given tastes of a liquid. You're given no information about it, you can't see it, let's say, you're blindfolded, you're not told what it is, let's say it's a soda, but you're not told whether this is Coca-Cola, or Pepsi, or orange soda, or root beer, or anything else about it. Now, intuitively, you would say, well, that's easy. I can surely tell. Maybe Coke and Pepsi, maybe I get confused there with colas, that's kind of close. But come on. Orange soda, root beer, Dr. Pepper, I can easily tell those apart. Well, try that blindfold test. It turns out when you have no additional information, wow, it's really difficult. What flavor is that? And in fact, some makers have been lately experimenting with that, playing around with it, saying, this month we introduced the mystery flavor. And it's colorless, so there's no information from the color. It has a flavor, but you taste it. And now you have no idea what the range is. It's not like, it's Coke or Dr. Pepper or root beer or orange soda. Instead, in this case, it could be any fruit flavor, let's say, at all. Which one is it? Was that pineapple or mango or orange or tangerine, or I at least have found I can't do it at all. I do have the information in the bottle, but nothing else, and there's nothing about the color or anything else that helps me identify that flavor. I have no idea what it is. Strangely, because if I open something and it says pineapple, I immediately taste it as pineapple. Banana, yeah, I taste it as banana, as orange or whatever. Without that information, without a context, without something that helps you, you can't do it. So, with respect to taste, with respect to colors, we are terrible at identifying anything. If it is artificially isolated, we can't identify the true nature at all. We're always making these judgments in comparison with other things. Now you might think, well look, that shows that the comparison helps us. But actually it's not true. Take things of the same color and put them in different contexts, different lighting, for example, or put them next to objects. We've already looked in studying illusions at cases where the same color appears radically different in different backgrounds, where squares of the same color appear to be very different colors, depending on their positions on a board, for example. Or where a bar of one consistent color looks radically different as the background changes. As the gradient in the background changes, it looks as if there's a gradient change in the bar itself. But it's not true. It's not happening. It's all the same. And so the context affects things radically. A few years ago, there was a popular internet sensation. What color is the dress? It's not just an instance of illusion. In different lighting and against different backgrounds, the dress either looked blue and black or white and gold. And you might say, but that's ridiculous. How can the same thing appear white and gold in one context and blue and black in another context? I know of people who actually tried to order the dress to get it, to find out what color is it really. It turned out to sell out very quickly. It was hard to obtain. But it's like, wait, those are so different. How could that possibly be? And yet it was the case. We're actually terrible at identifying colors, except as part of a context, but the way in which we perceive it is radically affected by the context. But now there's not only the dependence on other objects in the context, there is also the problem of, now, what happens really? I've drawn the line as a line between mind and world, but if we think about what's happening in our perceptual system, we realize that actually light rays are coming from the triangle into the eye, forming a pattern on the retina, That's being transferred by the optic nerve to the brain. The brain is then processing this and producing that mental representation. So think about what's going on here. We have the apparatus of the eye. We have the optic nerve. And in case you think that's a minor factor, look, it's just a tube transferring information, it's not really true. There's a huge amount of information on the retina that is not transferred via the optic nerve up to the brain. Our focal position is actually very, very limited. If you focus on this part of the scene, you're not seeing what's over here. That's partly what enables magicians to do what they do. They can be doing something with this hand, but you're not looking there. You're looking at this. They're making you focus on this, and this hand can be doing all sorts of things. You're not able to perceive it. It's not that the information isn't on your retina. It is. It's just not getting transferred to your brain. You might think, well, that's too bad. Why aren't we built in such a way that that information does get transferred to the brain? Well, we'd have to have a very large brain. In fact, one psychologist once told me that our brains would have to weigh as much as dump trucks if all of the information on the retina were actually transferred up to the brain for processing. But then the brain takes this two-dimensional information, or actually just electrical information, which it then interprets as two-dimensional, and then becomes three-dimensional information, and projects a three-dimensional image in the mind. And in the process of that, of course, analyzes it, says, triangle, black. And so is able to actually come up with some categorization. There are a number of different stages to what Immanuel Kant then calls modes of synthesis taking place in the mind. We've got some synthesis happening in the eye and then forming the visual representation. Then we categorize things as objects, we put labels on them. A huge amount is happening there in processing. So we've got the problem of context, and I'll just label this in general as the problem of processing. Taking place in our perceptual system and in our cognitive systems. At this point we say, okay, I see the problem. You're really saying that my representation is not just the result of the nature of the object. If it were just this, the object getting represented in the representation, we might say, look, yeah, of course, I can talk about the relationship between my mind and the world because there's very direct relationship. My mind is perceiving the way the world is. Simple, right? Not so simple. It's really the object, but plus its context, plus its surroundings, that set of objects with which it's being compared, with which it's admixed, and then we have plus all of the processing that's happening within me neurophysiologically. All of the processing taking place within my perceptual system, within my cognitive system, by my brain, to actually produce that representation. So, the representation is something that reflects aspects of all three of these things. Now, what's the problem? Well, the problem is we want to solve for that. We want to solve for the nature of the object. But imagine that we've got an equation in math. Let's just say this, something like R is equal to O plus C plus P. And now I say solve for O. Well, you say, okay, O equals R minus C minus P. Yes, seems fair enough, but now we know the representation, right? We have access to that, so that's not a problem. The difficulty is, I don't know what the context is contributing. I don't know what the processing is contributing. So I have no way of identifying the aspects of this representation that reflect the true nature of the object, and those that are being supplied by the context, those that are being supplied by my own processing system. So I can't tell what the object is really like. But look, it's the object that's in the world. So I say, hey, I can trust my state of mind to be a reflection of the world. The argument from comparison says, no, you can't. Actually, your representation is the outcome of all sorts of things. The object is only one part of that. So try to solve for the object, figure out what the nature of the object is. Yes, the representation gives you some clue to that, but on the other hand, you've got a context and your own perceptual and cognitive systems that are processing this in a way that allows you to see just the outcome of the function. So it really is like we've got this mathematical function, for example, established by our perceptual and cognitive systems. It's operating not on the object alone. If it were just a question of separating the processing from the object, that'd be hard enough, but maybe with the help of cognitive psychology we can make some progress there. But now it's going to turn out that it's not just the object coming in, it's all this other stuff that affects our perception of the object. And so there are many, many different inputs coming in. We're trying to formulate a clear perception of one, but we've got this black box that's operating on all of this. And even if we start looking inside the mechanism somehow through cognitive psychology, through neurophysiology, in other ways, it's going to be impossible to isolate what was the contribution from that one object considered in itself. So the argument from comparison says, there is too much else going on. The way you perceive an object in the world depends on its context in the world. It depends on the details of your processing system. The outcome is a function, let's say, of the object and its context and that processing. The problem is you have no way of isolating what the true nature of the object is. So you have no reason to think any given aspect of your representation is really reflecting the way the world is, as opposed to the outcome of a process that involves many, many other inputs.